So what is your resting place? It's the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, looking out as the mist rises and out across white-topped peaks. Maybe it's wading in the gentle waves of the beach with the soft sand between your toes. Or perhaps it's holding in your hand a full-grown vegetable that you planted as a tiny seed in your garden just this past spring. This is the stuff of God's creation, and they connect us to the very soul of God's creative energy, an energy that lives within us. From the dust of the ground to the waters of the deep to the stars of the heavens, it's all God's. And this world, this garden in which we live, is where we have been placed in our time, in our generation. A garden which we are called to serve and preserve. So today, as we talk about and think about caring for our earth and for our bodies, these creations of the Almighty Creator, I want us to take a closer look at the second chapter of Genesis, verse 15. Now, perhaps it's a good time to remind ourselves that there are two creation stories in Genesis. The first is found in chapter 1, and the second, which we read part of today, from chapter 2. Both of these creation stories have different emphases and notably different purposes, roles for humans in creation. So in the first story from Genesis 1, after God created male and female, God gave the humans dominion over the earth, told them to subdue it and have rule over all that God created. But how often do we think that means controlling by force? That's why we need the second creation story. You see, in the second chapter of Genesis, we read a much more personal experience of God creating humanity, forming a man out of the dust of the ground and breathing God's breath into the man's nostrils, giving life to his soul. And then God plants a garden and causes to grow all trees that are pleasant to look at and that are good for food. And then we get to verse 15. You can see it in your bulletin if you want to. We read, "Then God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it." Now, noticeably, there is no mention in this second part about having control over the earth. But even beyond that, I think there's something else that's been lost in translation. You see, if we look at the Hebrew text, this verse can also be translated to read something like this: "The Lord God took the man to rest in the Garden, Eden, to serve and preserve it." Now, I find it curious that resting was left off entirely from the English versions. Talk about American culture. Don't know that it's an influence here, but I'm also struck by humanity's purpose in the garden. When we expand these words, till and keep, that they mean also to serve and to preserve. Doesn't that paint a much wider, fuller image of God's role, of humanity's role in caring for God's creation? And then connecting both of these creation stories, we can ask ourselves, what does serving and preserving have to do with ruling over creation? Could it be about using our power for good? And maybe it begins with resting, with finding time in our busy today to go to our happy place. Maybe it is a mountain peak, or a park, or the beach, or in your garden, or just letting your feet touch the grass in your yard. Finding ways to get outside and connect with the soul of the earth. Then, in that enjoyment and restfulness, we must find our motivation to take steps to serve and preserve what we've been given. To this end, we have to become aware. We have to learn what we're doing to creation. Did you know that 40% of the U.S. food production goes to the landfills? 40%. But that doesn't just mean the food that we have goes to landfill. It means all of the energy used to go from farm to plate is wasted. Energy of harvesting, planting, harvesting, the land, the water, transportation, all of it, 40% wasted. Did you know that 40% of the world's oceans are covered with plastic? 40%. And consider all of the shortcuts that we've taken to create convenience and comfort, using pesticides and fossil fuels and plastics and disposables, and the list goes on, all because we want it easier and faster and more convenient. Yet we have to ask ourselves, is an easy or convenient life worth leaving a degraded environment, a dying garden, for our children, for our children's children? Then, after connecting with God's creative energy and nature and learning how our practices are causing harm to the world, that motivation moves us to the things we can do. Reduce, reuse, recycle, that old adage. We can buy smarter, live more sustainably. We can learn our carbon footprint and find ways to reduce it. But even beyond that, we need to fight for legislation that focuses corporations toward clean energy production practices to reduce pollution emissions. After all, it's these large corporations that are producing the largest amount of pollution in our environment. Even still, we are all in this together. I think above all, we have to believe, as Debbie said in her video, our choices matter. We have been given dominion over this planet, and we can make a difference. As stewards, we must remember that this created world and our created bodies, they belong to God. And in them and through them and within them lives the very soul of God. And yes, God gave us this earth and the power to subdue it. But God put us in this garden not to abuse that power, but to use it to serve the earth and to preserve it, this gift that sustains us for generations to come. Thanks be to God.